This episode contains discussion of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. Fear becomes heavier when it lasts too long. Not simply because people remain afraid, but because prolonged fear changes the emotional relationship human beings have with ordinary life itself. At first, vigilance can feel temporary, a response to uncertainty, a way of regaining emotional control whilst danger still feels undefined. But, over time, constant anticipation becomes exhausting, because human beings are not designed to remain emotionally alert indefinitely. Eventually, fear stops feeling like interruption and starts becoming atmosphere. Something carried quietly through routines, conversations, environments, and decisions that once required no emotional effort at all. And by this stage in the Yorkshire Ripper case, that emotional weight was becoming increasingly difficult to escape. Fear had now existed long enough to begin settling into the background of everyday life. Not always dramatically, not always consciously, but persistently. And psychologically, persistence matters, because emotional states that last for prolonged periods of time begin changing the way that people think, the way that people interpret, anticipate, and emotionally experience the world around them. At first, fear can sharpen attention. It can create vigilance. It can temporarily increase a sense of control by encouraging people to become more aware of possible danger. But prolonged vigilance carries emotional consequences of its own, because eventually the mind and body begin paying the psychological cost of remaining alert for too long. Welcome. It is a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles, Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper. Episode 6, The Weight of Fear. By now, fear surrounding the case was no longer developing only through isolated incidents. It had become reinforced through repetition, through conversation, through media coverage, through the repeated emotional experience of uncertainty continuing without resolution. And emotionally, repetition changes the way that human beings process threat. Because repeated exposure gradually shifts fear from being reactive to becoming anticipatory. People no longer needed direct reminders in order to feel emotionally affected. The atmosphere itself had started carrying tension. And when emotional tension becomes embedded deeply enough into everyday life, people begin adapting around it almost automatically. Ordinary behaviour changes quietly at first. Routes become habits of caution. Conversations become shaped by warning and reassurance. People begin thinking ahead emotionally before entering situations that once required no thought at all. And over time, those small emotional adjustments begin accumulating into something heavier, something more exhausting. Because constant vigilance requires energy, mental energy, emotional energy, physical energy. And as human beings, we are not naturally built to sustain heightened emotional alertness indefinitely without consequence. Eventually, vigilance begins creating fatigue, not because danger has disappeared, but because the emotional effort required to continuously anticipate danger becomes too difficult to maintain over a long period of time. And that fatigue can begin expressing itself in different ways. Some people become increasingly anxious. Some emotionally detach. Some begin normalizing fear simply as part of everyday life because psychologically, the mind often adapts to prolonged stress by attempting to make it feel survivable. But adaptation does not mean absence of harm. Sometimes it means people are learning how to carry fear differently. By this stage, media coverage surrounding the case had also begun intensifying the emotional atmosphere surrounding public life. And emotionally, repeated exposure matters. Because the more frequently people encounter stories involving danger, uncertainty, or violence, the more psychologically present those threats begin feeling within ordinary thought itself. Fear becomes easier to access emotionally, easier to imagine, easier to anticipate. And anticipation changes behaviour long before direct experience ever occurs. That is one of the reasons prolonged media exposure can become so emotionally influential during periods of public fear. Not necessarily because every individual report changes understanding dramatically, but because repetition reinforces emotional atmosphere. People hear discussions repeatedly. They read headlines repeatedly. They encounter warnings repeatedly. And over time, repeated emotional exposure strengthens the sense that fear itself has become part of ordinary life. In 1980, Marguerite was killed. She was 47 years old. And it is important to resist allowing repetition to emotionally flatten the individuality of the people at the very centre of this case. Because behind every victim existed a life filled with relationships, memories, routines, experiences, and moments that mattered independently of the violence that later brought them into public attention. And emotionally, repetition can create dangerous forms of distance. The more violence repeats publicly, the easier it can become for people to begin processing events structurally rather than personally, as pattern, as investigation, as ongoing story, instead of as individual human loss. And emotionally, that distancing effect matters deeply. Because when repeated violence becomes normalised within public awareness, empathy itself can begin changing shape. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming harder to sustain with the same emotional immediacy over prolonged periods of time. That does not mean that people stop caring. Often it means people are emotionally overwhelmed. And emotional overwhelm changes the way that fear and grief are processed collectively. At the same time, investigative pressure continued intensifying, and prolonged pressure creates emotional fatigue institutionally as well as publicly. Because investigations unfolding over long periods of time do not occur within emotionally neutral conditions. They unfold within urgency, within expectation, within growing frustration, within repeated exposure to uncertainty that remains unresolved despite ongoing effort. And emotionally unresolved effort can become exhausting because human beings rely upon progress in order to maintain emotional confidence in what they are doing. We need reassurance that actions are leading somewhere meaningful, that understanding is increasing, that resolution remains possible. But prolonged uncertainty weakens emotional certainty over time. And once emotional certainty weakens, frustration often begins emerging alongside fear. Those frustrations can affect cognition. It can narrow thinking. It can increase emotional pressure surrounding decisions, intensifying the need for answers capable of relieving prolonged tension. And emotionally, that creates an increasingly difficult environment within which careful judgment must still somehow be maintained. In 1980, Jacqueline Hill was killed. She was 20 years old and was studying at university. And again, I find it important to pause before allowing the structure of the case to overshadow the individuality of the life within it. Because behind public reporting and investigation existed a young lady whose future extended far beyond the circumstances that later brought her into public memory. A life shaped by ordinary moments, high ambitions, relationships, routines, and experiences that mattered to the person living them. And by this stage in the case, emotional exhaustion surrounding fear had become increasingly difficult to separate from ordinary public life itself. Because Prolonged uncertainty changes the emotional atmosphere people exist within. Not all at once, but gradually enough for fear to begin feeling less like interruption and more like background reality. And emotionally, that shift is deeply significant. Because once fear becomes embedded into ordinary life strongly enough, people begin adapting around it rather than expecting it to disappear. Looking back, it can be tempting to imagine fear as something sharp and immediate. But often, prolonged fear becomes heavy instead, quieter, more exhausting, more emotionally woven into the background of ordinary life. And that kind of fear can become particularly difficult to recognise whilst living inside it. Because gradual emotional change rarely announces itself clearly. People simply begin carrying tension differently over time, until eventually emotional vigilance starts to feel normal, even when the weight of it continues causing harm underneath the surface. Before we close, it is important to take a moment to step away from fear, investigation, media attention, and analysis, and return to the people at the centre of it. Marguerite Walls, Jacqueline Hill. Both were individuals whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances discussed here. Lives that were shaped by the relationships around them, experiences, ambitions, routines, memories, and figures that existed independently of this case. And recognising that matters, because without that recognition, it becomes too easy to focus only on escalation, investigation, and public fear, whilst losing sight of the people most deeply affected by them. In the next episode, we move further into the growing pressure surrounding the investigation, examining how media attention, emotional fatigue, and the increasing need for resolution continued shaping public perception and investigative response. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow so that you don't miss what comes next. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.